Hi, welcome to the second episode of Johnny Does .NET. In this series of videos, I will talk about my favorite programming platform, .NET. And in this episode, I will talk about the history, but also the future of the .NET Framework, .NET Core, and .NET. If you are trying to find more information about .NET online, you will immediately see that there is actually multiple versions of .NET out there, and there's also documentation for multiple versions out there. We talk about .NET, but when you look online, you will see that some people will talk about the .NET Framework, other people will talk about .NET Core, and other people will just say .NET. So, what are the differences between the .NET platform or .NET Framework or .NET Core or just .NET? Of course, the .NET platform, as I talked about in my previous video, is already 20 years old today. And so today in 2022, the .NET platform celebrated its 20th anniversary. .NET came out in 2002, which is already a long time ago. Back in those days, Microsoft decided to build this new platform. They called it the .NET Framework, and it was platform independent. But what Microsoft meant by platform independent was that the .NET platform would run on multiple different PCs that were running some kind of Windows operating system. So the .NET platform was platform independent, which meant it runs on different Windows operating systems on different processor architectures that are also supported by Windows, which basically means the 32-bit and the 64-bit hardware architectures out there. So when time went on, Microsoft knew that the world was evolving and that multiple programming platforms outside of .NET were already supporting this really platform independence, where it could run on other operating systems, but also on other hardware architectures. So at one point in time, Microsoft decided, with the fact that cloud was also becoming very popular, we need a .NET framework that also supports multi-platform, and Microsoft basically decided to create a new framework which they called the .NET Core framework, or just .NET Core for short. They decided not to upgrade .NET Framework to support this, but they decided to start from scratch and build a completely new framework, .NET Core. So they had the chance to really start over, do things better than they did before, and also tweak a number of things so they could have increased performance and stuff like that. So basically, in a few years back, we had two .NET platforms simultaneously. We had the .NET Framework and .NET Core. You as a developer had to choose between one of those two. Am I going to use the .NET Framework, where I can build applications specifically for Windows? Or do I use .NET Core to build real platform independent and maybe even cloud native applications that can run on my local PC, but also run without any issue in a cloud environment? Of course, things were quite complicated. As a developer, when we needed some documentation or when we tried to find help online, we really needed to be careful, because some things were meant for the .NET Framework and other things were meant for .NET Core. So we needed to make sure that we picked the correct information for the correct platform that we were using. A number of years ago, Microsoft also decided that maybe it's a little bit too confusing and the .NET Framework basically has no future, because it was Windows only, and today we don't want to do Windows only anymore. We really want to build applications in the cloud. So Microsoft decided, let's just go forward into the future with only one unified version of .NET, which we will just call .NET. And that's the reason why we have these three different names for the platform .NET. .NET Framework, .NET Core, and just .NET. If we step back into the past and look at the .NET Framework, I already told you before, 20 years ago, today is 2022, so 20 years ago, the .NET Framework came out with its first version in 2002, and it was a very simple day back then. We could build web applications by using ASP.NET Web Forms. We could create Windows desktop applications by using WinForms, and we could create basically console applications and do whatever we want with them. So very easy, not a lot of options there. But then when the years went on, of course, we got newer versions of the .NET framework. We got version 1.1, version 2, version 3, and so forth. The last version of the .NET framework that still exists today is version 4.8, which came out in 2019, which is the current and latest version of the .NET framework. Now, throughout this history of the .NET framework, lots of functionalities were getting added to that platform, which meant the runtime, but also the SDK, they were growing and growing and growing. So the .NET framework today is quite a large package, quite a large platform with lots of functionalities. So we are now not only doing the ASP.NET Web Forms and WinForms. No, there's much more technologies added to the .NET framework that we can use today to create all kinds of .NET applications. That is actually also one of the reasons that Microsoft decided to do .NET Core from scratch. They could go back to the core, hence the name .NET Core, and really start over and look into the slimness of the platform, but also the performance of the platform. So if you want to use a very specific technology as a developer that is not part of that base package of .NET Core, you can easily add it by adding external packages to that. And this is actually more flexible than trying to put everything inside of one big framework, because if you as a developer create a very simple, a very small console application that only has a few lines of code, it's actually pretty weird that you need to install the complete .NET runtime with all of its fancy features attached to it, because your application doesn't need most of that. And with .NET Core, you can basically choose yourself which packages you are going to use by just adding them whenever you need them, and then the runtime itself will stay slim because those packages that you are using are part of your application and not part of the runtime, which also increases performance for smaller applications and so forth. So yeah, as I told you, the .NET Framework, the latest version is from 2019, which today in 2022 is 3 years ago. It indeed looks like Microsoft is not spending any more time in the .NET Framework. So how do we need to cope with that? Well, if we look at this table, you can see that this table has some dates, and these are the support dates for all the different .NET Framework versions. The older versions, like version 1.0, 2.0, and so on, as you can see, they are already out of support for a long time. The first version of the .NET Framework is out of support since 2006, which is more than 15 years ago. Which means if you are still trying to use the .NET Framework 1.0 today, that is a bad idea, because Microsoft is not supporting that version anymore. Microsoft will not do bug fixes. If there's a functionality that has a problem, Microsoft will not fix that. But also when your application has some security issue, because of the .NET Framework you are using, Microsoft will not fix that because that version of the .NET Framework is not supported anymore. So you should really look into versions that are still supported today. And if you look at this table and then the top three entries within this table, you can see that the latest version 4.8, but also the somewhat older versions 4.6.2 and 4.7, 4.7.1 and 4.7.2, they are still supported, and they even don't have an end date, which means that they are still supported today and in the future. But we don't really know if they will be supported for the next 5 years, 15 years, 50 years. We have no idea. We only know that they are still supported today, which of course is a good thing if you are still using the .NET Framework or still want to use the .NET Framework. But like I told you, we have a new .NET platform, which is more modern, more performant, and it is platform independent, which is .NET Core. So the first version of .NET Core was in 2016. And as you saw from the .NET Framework, the last version of the .NET Framework was created in 2019, which indeed meant that Microsoft was building these two platforms simultaneously. So Microsoft was working on the .NET Framework simultaneously with .NET Core. So there were two platforms, and you as a developer had to choose which one to use. Of course, when you have a platform that is almost 20 years old, and you want to start over from scratch, so Microsoft started over from scratch, that is not an easy task. It will cost you a lot of time to really build that framework from scratch all over again. And that's also the reason why there were so many releases of .NET Core these first years when it came out. As you can see from this slide, there were two versions in 2016, only one in 17, but then again 2 in 2018 and also 2 in 2019. Basically, Microsoft began from scratch, but was not able to implement everything from the .NET Framework into .NET Core, which also doesn't really make sense because the .NET Framework was Windows only and .NET Core was platform independent. So some features from the .NET Framework do not make sense inside of .NET Core because some things are very Windows specific and you don't want them as part of .NET Core. So because of that, .NET Core is already a lot smaller in size for the runtime, for the SDK and so on, than the .NET Framework was. But also, Microsoft tried to implement as many features as possible, but was not able to do this for the first version, but they tried to close this gap with the versions that came later. So that's why there are so many releases, because additional functionality was being added to close that gap in between the .NET Framework and .NET Core. Now, .NET Core was actually quite successful. Many developers were using .NET Core instead of the .NET Framework, and Microsoft decided, okay, maybe it doesn't really make sense to keep these two platforms alive simultaneously, or at least create new versions of them simultaneously. Maybe we should look into the future, use the popularity of .NET Core, and use .NET Core as the base for the new .NET platform. Because of this, of course, .NET Core also went out of support quite quickly. So .NET Core has also support dates for all of its versions, and most of them are already out of support. I think, the only one that is remaining is .NET Core 3.1, which will go out of support by December 2022. So I'm recording this video in 2022, which means that .NET Core 3.1 is still supported today in 2022, but will not be supported after December this year, which means that when you're still using .NET Core, you need to upgrade to the newer .NET platform, which is a good thing because now Microsoft forces everyone to use the latest .NET platform, or when you really need to, you can stay with the older .NET Framework, which is also still supported, but we don't know for how long. Now, what happened with .NET Core? As I told you before, Microsoft looked into the future, and we are going ahead with only one platform, which is called .NET. And .NET is just basically the same as .NET Core. Microsoft did not start from scratch all over again. No, they are basing themselves on .NET Core, and they are using .NET Core, but just changed the name to .NET. So .NET 5 is the next version of .NET Core, where .NET Core, the latest version, was 3.1, which is also a little bit weird. What happened to .NET Core 4 or .NET 4? Well, Microsoft decided to jump ahead to .NET 5 to avoid confusion with the .NET Framework, because today we are using .NET Framework, we are using the still supported version of .NET Framework 4.8. And if we are going to create a new .NET platform from .NET Core and also going to call it .NET 4, that will be a little bit confusing with .NET Framework 4. That's also why I think it's very important to use these platform names correctly. So we have the .NET Framework for the older .NET platform, we have .NET Core for the new platform independent one, and then we just use .NET for the modern version of .NET Core. And actually .NET 5, which is .NET Core, but the next version of it, came out in 2020, so almost 2 years ago. And Microsoft also decided to create a cadence where each November of each year, there will be a new major release of .NET. So in November 2020, we had .NET 5. In November 2021, last year, we had .NET 6. This year in 2022, in November, we will have .NET 7. And then in the upcoming years, we will have .NET 8, .NET 9, and so on. Some of these versions will be supported for a short amount of time. Some of these versions will be supported for a longer amount of time. Basically, each even version of .NET will be supported for a longer time, which is then called the long-term support or LTS version. .NET 6 from last year is one of those, and it will be supported for 3 years. Then .NET 7 will be an in-between release where it's not long-term support, so it will only be supported for 18 months, so 1 year and a half. And then the year after, .NET 8 will be there as the next long-term support version. So if you think logically about this, there will actually be 2 years in between each long-term support version. And if the long-term support is 3 years, you basically have 1 year to upgrade your application from one LTS to the next LTS. So if you are using .NET 6 today, you will need to upgrade to .NET 8 or later in between now and 3 years from the release of .NET 6. But if you wait until .NET 8 releases, you have 1 year to do this upgrade. Because we have 3 years of support and only 2 years in between the 2 long-term support version releases. If you put this in a table, you can already see that .NET 5, the first version of this new .NET platform based on .NET Core, will actually go out of support in 2022, more specifically in May 2022. So May 2022, when I'm recording this video, is basically next month. So if you're using .NET 5 right now, you should already upgrade to .NET 6, which is the first LTS release for the new .NET platform, which will then be supported for 3 years since its initial release in November last year. So it will be supported up until November 2024, 3 years from that, about 2 years and a half from now. And then .NET 7 will also be an 18-month support cycle, and then .NET 8 will be that next LTS release. So Microsoft has created this little table to help you with that. If you look at the LTS releases, starting from .NET Core 3.1, which was an LTS release, which will be patched for 3 years after its release, which was December 2019. So it will be supported up until December 2022, this year. And then .NET 5, which is a current release or an in-between release, which will only be patched for 18 months. So with this, there is a big change from what we had with the .NET Framework in the past. And the .NET Framework was supported for longer times, but it also meant that people were not upgrading that often. And there's a lot of older software running out there on older versions of the .NET platform. With .NET in the future, we should really follow these LTS support cycles where we always upgrade from one version to the other to make sure that it is still supported. And this is very important. Microsoft will do bug fixes on its platform, and more importantly, they will do security fixes. So whenever somebody finds a security flaw within the .NET runtime or SDK itself, Microsoft will fix that if you are using the latest long-term support versions. So you will be safe when you do that. The .NET will have a major new version every year, which means that it can have breaking changes, and it will probably have breaking changes. But if you follow one LTS by the next LTS version, it should be okay. You shouldn't be spending multiple months of trying to fix all the issues. No, Microsoft will provide you with the documentation and with the tools that will help you to upgrade from one version to the other. And if you just go from 6 to 8 and then from 8 to 10 and so on, these will be smaller steps, and you will need to fix a few things, but you will not spend weeks or months doing that. You will spend a very short amount of time to be able to do that. So I guess this will be a good balance between security and making your application compatible with the next versions of .NET. And that's it. That was the future and the history of the .NET platform. And with that, we reached the end of this episode, where I talked about the history, but also the future of .NET. In the next episode, I will go much deeper into what are the differences between the .NET Framework and the newer .NET Core and the new .NET platform. If you like this episode, give me a thumbs up, and if you want to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to my channel. Hope you liked it. See you next week.